Okay, greeting everyone, great to be here. The PowerPoint will be out soon. The focus of this study is the Albanian language within the North Macedonian territory. I'll go slightly side by side trying, okay, sorry, we're some small technical problem. So the focus of the study is generally figuring out language policies. In this period, the Albanian language North Macedonia have been, in the last particularly 15 years, have been through quite dramatic challenges in regards to advancing its status. And some of these advancements have been a continuous topic in most of the negotiations of the continuous government. We have had quite intensive period of about 6 different governments changing. And in most of these cases, this was the main topic that was discussed and raised strong and sometimes weak political points. And I guess you all know the reason. The language rights are also human rights, and it needs to get the necessary attention in this regard. So the study also analyzed the policies that have been gone through the whole period of these 15 years, in which after the agreement of Ohrid, or framework agreement, obviously took place. And although it was agreed in regards to implementation and the constitution, this was not implemented as expected. Let me just briefly create a general idea. So Macedonia was formally until 1991 part of the Federation of Yugoslavia. The country, as you can see here, with orange color, and interestingly enough, it's also the western part of it in which majority of Albanians live, and also in the 3 neighboring countries, including Albania as its largest territory, but also Kosovo and the southern part of Montenegro, sorry, in which there are speakers, ethnic speakers of Albanian language. In regards to Macedonia, as I said, the western part, it's a majority Albanians, in some cities over 50, in some cities over 80%. And but altogether within the country, the population of Albanians it is disputed among different statistics, and hopefully by the end of February we'll also get the official statistic in regards to the population, but it estimated between 25 to 40% of the population. Sorry, one second. Some parties tend to say that it's smaller. Some political parties tend to minimize depending on who is in power. But altogether, obviously, the population is not small. According to the UNESCO's Atlas, which is a quite old statistics from 2002, we have 7 endangered languages, even within this small territory of about 2 million population. So the languages, as you can see, are Adige, the Aromanian, Gaugauz of South Balkans, Megleno-Romanian, Judezmo-Romani, and Torlak. This is because the territory itself has been quite intensively, for a longer period, quite a large crossroad from the Roman time until later on with the Byzantine and the Turkish Empire, and all of these populations and changes within the political system have also changed the ruling population, and this also has affected certain languages to gain a better status and then lose them later on, and so on and so forth. Luckily, within these 7 languages, the Albanian language is not one of the endangered languages. However, there were certain developments from 45 after the World War II, of the end of the World War II, in which the status of Albanian language have been decreased, its popularity also, and often, as you know now already, with endangered languages, the first thing that the first signs of the language being considered not endangered but vulnerable in one sense is that when it's not becoming the language of privilege, of prestige, and often it's not even the language of the economical trade. The situation has changed dramatically after 2001, in which after a civil war of the Albanian guerrilla, there was an agreement in which advancement of political status of Albanian would be advanced, and advancement covered many fields of life, from political and economical, and including cultural within that, the advancement of the Albanian language. And technically, this was a good step forward to move on further and see how certain language policies could be advanced. However, although it was signed officially through a number of international presences, it did not necessarily function directly in the terrain. It took at least 7 years until the first law on languages was implemented, or at least put in power, or discussed in the parliament. And later on, there was continuous disputes about how this language policy technically was implemented in line with what was going on in the country. And there were a number of factors that happened earlier that was affecting the language in regards to the developments. Both of these have been discussed and explained in more details within the paper, but one of them is that there was no official usage of the language except the primary and the secondary education in Macedonia. Much of language usage in institutions was not allowed, including courts, municipalities, and so on and so forth. So if in Yugoslavia, Serbo-Croatian was the language of prestige, and all other languages then depended on the republics in which they would get the status. And in this regard, in Macedonia, Macedonian was the language of privilege and prestige and official language, and less this was the case with other languages. As we said, the Ohrid Framework Agreement put the agenda forward, and the situation got quite dramatic later on. In 2008, we got the first draft of the law on usage of the Albanian language, and the last version we have was somewhere in 2017, and this was quite dramatic in the sense that the previous government was not happy with the proposals of the Albanian bloc in regards to promoting these rights, and even there was some clashes and protestants went, if you remember, it was on the news, international news. In 27th of April 2017, protesters went inside the parliament and even attacked physically, and some of the members of the parliament, including the head of the opposition in that period, Mr. Zjerin Sela, was considered even dead. Luckily, he survived. There was pictures in which he was dragged within the parliament, and all these clashes was more or less a lack of parts of the society to be open and see language rights or human rights as part of the natural development of the 21st century reality. Luckily, the head of the opposition survived, and later on, a few months later, the latest version of the law of language usage is in power in Macedonia, and some more steps have been done to move this forward. Among these new changes was also that in this serious deal of agreements and negotiations, not only the changes promoted were there, but also the head of the parliament became Albanian, which seems very symbolic at this period, but earlier it was a big deal in regards to push forward these particular laws. What is the status of the Albanian language before that? From 45 until 91, so by the end of the World War II, according to Rugova in the publication of the Academy of Science of Republic of Kosovo, the status of Albanian language was of a second order in Kosovo. In Macedonia, it was of third or even fourth order, because Serbo-Croatian was the main language in this regard, and then Macedonian in one of the republics. And by Albania has been considered minority in that this was not necessarily always in the agenda in the communist regime. And as I said, the language was not included in any of the correspondence, and there was lack of usage of language. And large number of Albanian speakers somehow, because of the deflation of the status of the language, felt much more closer to Orthodox Albanians, mainly to the Macedonian language, and it is considered from some reports there are about 300,000 speakers of Albanian language from Orthodox religion in Macedonia. Then slowly within these 40 years assimilate into a Macedonian population. In the last 10 years, some of this population is becoming more and more aware of this fact. There are some moments in which we've had even few members of the parliament who now officially declare that they are Albanian, although the origin, although they've been proclaimed for a longer period, at least after the World War II, that they've been members of the Macedonian population. The point is not really how they declare themselves, but because of this lack of language policies, assimilation became larger and larger. We're talking, if 300,000 it's a big number for a population in Macedonia, in which we believe there are at least between 300 to 600,000 more Albanians from Muslim population. So if you put all this number together, obviously the drop is about 30% of the population, which is quite large for this 40 years of Macedonia after the World War II. And as a result of that, there was more and more stronger focus towards language focuses and language rights. So within the study, you can see there's a long explanation about all these technical developments. In that regard, what I will do today, we'll speak about, I don't know, am I going back or forward with these slides? I think I'm going backwards, sorry. What is important in this context to mention that it was not only these 6 decades of Albanian language not being official or formal language in the country in which more than 25% of the population is officially, we believe it's around 40%. It will be up to the statistic to prove that. But there was another development that has impacted the language because suddenly with the formation of Yugoslavia and this great federation of 6 different republics, small ethnic groups in this great federation have lost its voice, and this voice it's quite important if the population, if the language contact seems to be much affected by the languages of prestige in that period, Serbo-Croatian language. In this regard, parts of the population of North Macedonia moved inside the federation, and they continued to work. Mainly, they were quite involved for economical purposes within the federation, mainly in Croatia, Bosnia, and Montenegro. And after they came back, linguistically, there are a number of studies that prove that these people, not because their language was endangered, but because they had a very strong contact with the language of prestige in that period, the formal language, which is Serbo-Croatian. A number of lexical terms have been disappearing quite intensively. Luckily, a number of studies show that the syntax has not changed. So we're kind of revitalizing the whole process now, because throughout this period in North Macedonia, there were no universities in Albanian language. There are two state universities, one public-private university supported by European Union, which is the Southeast European University where I come from. So the situation, it's a good example of revitalization. Again, the language was not endangered, but it was moving towards more and more language speakers being assimilating and turning into the more prestige languages.
5 minutes.
Okay. In another factor in this process of language developments or language policy is globalization. I'm not going to go much into this. This is something that it's been widely analyzed, and it would not serve this setting, the scene here, because you know this, and this is not just globalization is not just hitting Albanians in North Macedonia, but all over the continent. And in both of the cases, we have some studies of sociolinguistics, and there are elements of individual language and micro social economical analysis, which make us realize that language is not always related to how many speakers of that language has, but also what is the status of that language in regards to economy, in regards to prestige. And this happened in North Macedonia. We were losing this territory for over 6 decades, but now it is coming back, luckily. And in a study we did in 2019 in regards to how the society is reacting to these language changes, it seems like all the state sector was kind of slowly implementing this, and very often this was done on purpose. There were many cases in which the president of the country would not sign the law on languages, although the government already agreed, and the government is the majority of the political system. And in a study I did in 2019, we analyzed how the private sector is reacting. And this is a chart in which you could see easily most of the banks which are not forced by the government to use multilingual policies, they are open to that and they don't mind, although it's not allowed by the bank, but nor is prohibited. So economy becomes an element here, and more positive reflection is from the private sector compared to the state sector to use language, because they see this as potential customers and it helps the overall development. Altogether, in order to conclude this, it's not enough to have this enthusiasm about how the private sector will solve this problem, but it was needed to have an institution that will run somehow the language developments, particularly when this language was revitalized. So the government put together also the Agency for Implementation of the Language. In that period, it was called the Agency of the Implementation of Languages. In order not to mention Albanian language, they invented this long name called Implementation of Population in Macedonia. It's over 20%. It was quite a long name. And then after it was voted in the parliament, they squeezed the name in these 3 words, Agency for Implementation of the Languages, which is a quite clear agenda, making sure the language policies and administrative technology is put in line, training for translators and proofreading for all institutions that provide official documents, and more or less they have a clear agenda which is proven, and they have a clear budget, so it's much positive now. To conclude, the Albanian language luckily is not endangered currently in Macedonia, although if in the future it loses its economical value or cultural value, this might be a case. And of course, in general, we try to reflect on how this damage was done in the last 6 decades. Luckily, things have changed, and they're not very pinky now. There are lots of problems, but in general, some pragmatic language policies will, as a conclusion, would be that some pragmatic policies that do not endanger minority or non-majority languages should be considered by every government, since language rights are also human rights, and human rights are signed by all conventions, so there should not be an issue. And of course, it's not only improving in Macedonia, it's not only improving the status of the language, but it's the good language policies are soothing down or are relaxing the interethnic relations, which sometimes they become very dramatic in Macedonia. We remember the conflicts of 2001, and now the conflict the country has with Greece and Bulgaria. So it's a nice way of calming things down and also promoting good language policies. This is all I have for now. Thank you.